June 6, 1944, stands as one of the most pivotal dates in human history. The beaches of Normandy, France, witnessed an unprecedented amphibious assault that would ultimately lead to the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi occupation. Thousands of brave Allied soldiers stormed heavily fortified beaches under withering enemy fire, sacrificing their lives to establish a foothold on occupied territory. The images of that day, soldiers wading through surf under machine gun fire, landing craft disgorging troops onto hostile shores, medics tending to the wounded amid chaos, have been seared into our collective memory through countless films, documentaries, and history books. But what happened after D-Day? What challenges did the Allied forces face once they moved beyond the beaches? This is where the history books often become vague, glossing over the brutal weeks that followed the initial invasion. The truth is that the Allied advance very nearly ground to a complete halt. Not because of superior German armor, not because of artillery bombardments, and not because of tactical brilliance on the part of enemy commanders. The Normandy campaign almost failed because of hedgerows, ancient agricultural boundaries that transformed the French countryside into a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. This is the story of Normandy Beach on that fateful June day, where a Sherman tank named Fury took a direct hit during the initial assault. The crew, trained to follow protocol in such situations, abandoned their damaged vehicle as they had been taught. For them, the mission was over. Their tank was compromised, and survival meant getting clear before ammunition cooked off or fuel ignited. It was the sensible decision, the one that military doctrine demanded. But one man refused to leave. Sergeant Curtis Culin possessed no engineering degree from a prestigious university. He had no special training in metallurgy, physics, or advanced mechanics. His credentials consisted of years spent in a New Jersey garage, fixing cars and trucks for working-class customers who needed their vehicles running but couldn't afford fancy repairs. What he did have was something far more valuable: a mechanic's intuition for how machines worked, an ability to see solutions where trained engineers saw only insurmountable obstacles, and the audacity to believe that sometimes the craziest ideas are the most brilliant. When Cullen announced his intention to modify a damaged tank using nothing but scrap metal and a welding torch, his commanding officer's reaction was predictable. The plan sounded insane. It violated conventional military engineering wisdom. It seemed like the desperate fantasy of a man who'd spent too long in combat, whose judgment had been compromised by stress and exhaustion. Taking an already damaged tank, welding crude steel prongs to its front, and then deliberately driving it at full speed into solid earthen walls that had stood for centuries. This wasn't tactics. It was suicide with extra steps. But what Sergeant Curtis Culin built in just 48 hours of feverish work would fundamentally change the entire invasion. His invention was so elegantly simple, so brilliantly effective, that when General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, saw it demonstrated, he immediately ordered 5,000 copies to be manufactured and distributed throughout the Allied armored forces. This single-field modification, created by an enlisted man with no formal engineering credentials, would be credited with shortening the Normandy campaign by weeks. possibly months, saving thousands of Allied lives and accelerating the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. This is the story they don't teach in history class, the one that gets footnoted in military histories, but rarely receives the attention it deserves. This is the story of how a sergeant with a blowtorch, a stubborn refusal to accept defeat, and an unshakable belief in the power of practical problem-solving saved D-Day from becoming a strategic stalemate. Stay with this narrative until the end, because what happened next, how Cullen's invention was tested, deployed, and ultimately vindicated, shocked everyone who witnessed it, from skeptical officers to battle-hardened tank crews who had given up hope of surviving the Normandy hedgerows. The nightmare that history forgot. Normandy's hedgerow hell. Normandy, France, June 1944. 6 days had passed since the momentous D-Day landings, and according to the carefully constructed plans developed by Allied strategists, the invasion force should have been pushing rapidly inland, liberating French towns and villages, disrupting German supply lines, and positioning themselves for the eventual drive toward Paris and ultimately into Germany itself. The beaches had been secured at tremendous cost in blood and courage. The initial German counterattacks had been repelled. Naval gunfire and air superiority had given the Allies a decisive advantage in firepower. Everything should have been proceeding according to plan. Instead, the Allied advance had ground to a complete and demoralizing halt. The culprit wasn't superior German armor, though the enemy's Panther and Tiger tanks were formidable adversaries. It wasn't devastating artillery barrages, though German gunners were skilled and well-positioned. It wasn't even the fighting spirit of the Wehrmacht soldiers defending their occupied territory. The factor that brought the world's most powerful military force to a standstill was something that most Allied planners had barely considered: hedgerows. To understand why these agricultural features became such devastating military obstacles, we need to appreciate what Normandy hedgerows actually were. These weren't the decorative, neatly trimmed hedges that you might find bordering a suburban lawn or garden. Normandy hedgerows, called bocage by the French locals, were ancient barriers with roots, both literal and figurative, stretching back centuries into European agricultural history. Norman farmers, working the same land for generation after generation, had constructed these boundaries to delineate property lines, contain livestock, and protect crops from harsh coastal winds. Over hundreds of years, these barriers had evolved into formidable structures. At their core was a foundation of earth and stone, carefully mounded and compacted. Into this foundation, farmers had planted dense, thorny bushes, trees, and shrubs. As decades and then centuries passed, the roots of these plants, these hedgerows, covered Normandy like a vast, organic maze. They surrounded virtually every field, creating a patchwork landscape where open ground was subdivided into countless small parcels, each one bordered by these ancient barriers. A single square mile of Norman farmland might contain dozens of these enclosed fields, each one a separate tactical challenge, each hedgerow a natural fortress that had to be overcome. For the American tank crews tasked with advancing through this landscape, the hedgerows became death traps of the worst kind. The Sherman tank, America's primary armored vehicle, was a capable machine in open terrain. It had reasonable armor protection, a reliable 75 mm gun, decent speed and maneuverability, and could generally hold its own against most German armor it encountered. But the Sherman had a critical vulnerability: its belly armor. Tank designers faced an eternal compromise. Armor thick enough to stop enemy shells was heavy. The heavier a tank became, the slower it moved, the more fuel it consumed, and the more powerful, and therefore heavier, its engine needed to be. To keep tanks mobile and mechanically reliable, designers had to make choices about where to place thick armor and where to economize with thinner protection. On the Sherman, as with most tanks of that era, the thickest armor protected the front of the vehicle, the glacis plate and turret front, where enemy fire was most likely to strike. The sides received moderate protection. The rear, where engines and transmissions were located, had enough armor to stop small arms fire and shell fragments, but would yield to direct hits from anti-tank weapons. And the belly, the underside of the hull, had the thinnest armor of all, barely enough to protect against mines, and certainly inadequate against direct fire from anti-tank weapons. This design made perfect sense in conventional tank warfare. Tanks typically engaged each other on relatively flat terrain, where the belly was protected by the ground itself and rarely exposed to enemy fire. But Normandy's hedgerows created a deadly exception to this rule. When a Sherman tank attempted to climb over a hedgerow, the inevitable happened. The tank would approach the earthen barrier and begin tilting upward as its tracks sought purchase on the mounded earth. As the tank's nose rose higher and higher, attempting to crest the top of the hedgerow, its belly armor became exposed, sometimes at an angle exceeding 45 degrees. For a few critical seconds, the Sherman's most vulnerable area was presented directly to any German soldiers positioned on the far side of the hedgerow. German infantry had come well prepared for tank encounters. They carried Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck anti-tank weapons, portable launchers that fired shaped charge warheads capable of penetrating armor through the focused detonation of high explosives. These weapons were devastatingly effective against thin armor at close range. A Panzerfaust that might bounce harmlessly off a Sherman's frontal armor could punch through the belly armor as easily as a knife through paper. The tactical situation was diabolically simple. German defenders would position themselves on the far side of a hedgerow and wait. When they heard the distinctive roar of a Sherman's engine approaching, they would ready their anti-tank weapons and watch the top of the hedgerow. The moment a Sherman's belly armor appeared, silhouetted against the sky as it crested the barrier, they would fire. One shot was usually all it took. The shaped charge warhead would penetrate the thin armor, and superheated metal fragments would spray into the tank's interior, igniting ammunition, fuel, and flesh. Sergeant Curtis Culin of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron watched this nightmare unfold day after day. He wasn't merely an observer. His unit was directly involved in operations that repeatedly encountered these deadly obstacles. He saw Shermans approach hedgerows with grim determination. He heard the engines strain as the tanks tilted upward, tracks clawing for purchase. He witnessed the terrible moment when a panzer... The crews rarely survived. The interior of a tank struck by a Panzerfaust became an instant inferno. Ammunition cooked off in chain reactions. Steel that was supposed to protect the crew instead became a crematorium, trapping them in a space that reached temperatures exceeding those of a blast furnace. Those crewmen who did escape the burning hulks were often traumatized beyond recovery. Their bodies burned, their minds shattered by the horror they'd experienced. The medics worked around the clock, treating burns, shock, and trauma. The grave's registration details, the grim soldiers tasked with handling the dead, worked overtime, processing casualties at a rate that should have been unthinkable for an army with overwhelming air superiority and numerical advantage. The replacement crews became increasingly reluctant to board the tanks, knowing that the hedgerows ahead might be the last thing they ever saw. The tactical situation had become desperate. Allied planners, working from maps and intelligence reports back in England, had calculated that the invasion force should have advanced 30 miles or more inland by this point in the campaign. The schedule called for the capture of key road networks, the liberation of major towns, and the establishment of supply depots far enough inland to support the next phase of operations. Instead, the advance was measured in yards per day. A determined unit might fight all day to capture a single field, only to face another hedgerow-enclosed field beyond it, and another beyond that, stretching to the horizon in an endless maze of agricultural boundaries that had been turned into fortress walls. Every field became a separate battle. Every hedgerow presented the same deadly problem. The Germans didn't need massive reinforcements or sophisticated tactics. They simply waited behind these ancient barriers and methodically destroyed American armor as it exposed itself, trying to cross. For Curtis Culin, who had been a mechanic in civilian life, this situation violated every principle of good engineering and common sense. He understood machines intuitively, the way some people understand music or mathematics. He grasped how forces interacted, how leverage worked, how to apply power efficiently to overcome resistance. And as he watched yet another Sherman erupt in flames after attempting to climb a hedgerow, something fundamental. The problem was that tanks were trying to go over them instead of through them. The solution seemed obvious once you saw it from the right angle. If you could somehow cut through the hedgerow at ground level, plowing through it rather than climbing it, the tank would never expose its vulnerable belly armor. The Germans couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. The Sherman's thick frontal armor would continue facing the enemy throughout the crossing, exactly as the tank's designers had intended. But recognition of the problem and conception of a solution were only the beginning. The real challenges lay ahead, convincing skeptical officers, actually building a working prototype, and proving that a crude field modification could succeed where sophisticated engineering solutions had failed. The mechanic's vision, when simplicity meets desperation. Curtis Culin was not an engineer, at least not in the formal sense that the military bureaucracy would recognize. He possessed no degree from MIT or West Point. His name appeared on no patents. He had published no papers in technical journals. His credentials, such as they were, consisted of years spent in a modest garage in New Jersey, where working-class families brought their failing vehicles and hoped that this quiet man with grease under his fingernails could work affordable miracles. But Culin understood something that many formally trained engineers sometimes forget. The best solutions are often the simplest ones. Complexity, for its own sake, is a trap that catches clever people who become enamored with their own ingenuity. The truly brilliant solution is the one that solves the problem with the minimum necessary intervention, using readily available materials and requiring no specialized tools or exotic expertise. Culin had seen this principle proven time and again in his garage work. When a customer's car wouldn't start, the problem was rarely something exotic requiring complete engine disassembly. Usually it was a loose connection, a clogged fuel line, or a worn belt. Simple problems with simple solutions, if you knew where to look and understood how systems actually worked, rather than how they theoretically should work. Now, watching the hedgerow problem claim tank after tank, Culin applied that same practical wisdom. The issue was straightforward. Tanks climbing over barriers exposed vulnerable areas to enemy fire. The solution, therefore, should be equally straightforward. Don't climb over, go through. He began sketching in a small notebook he always carried, a habit from his garage days, where he'd learned to capture ideas before they evaporated. His initial drawings were crude, but conceptually clear. He envisioned steel prongs, like enormous teeth or tusks, welded to the front of a Sherman tank. When the tank approached a hedgerow, instead of attempting to climb, it would ram directly into the barrier at ground level. The steel prongs would dig deep into the earthen foundation, creating leverage. As the tank pushed forward, the prongs would rip through roots and soil, essentially excavating a path rather than climbing over an obstacle. The physics made sense to Cullin's mechanically inclined mind. A Sherman tank weighed approximately 30 tons, 60,000 pounds of steel and mechanical components. That mass, accelerated to even moderate speed, represented tremendous kinetic energy. If that energy could be focused through properly designed prongs into the base of a hedgerow, something had to yield. And Culin was betting that centuries-old earth and roots, no matter how compacted and intertwined, would yield before hardened steel, driven by 30 tons of tank. His crewmates noticed his obsessive sketching and offered good-natured mockery. Cullin's at it again. They'd joke, "He's going to solve the whole war with his little drawings." The ribbing was affectionate, but contained an edge of skepticism. Many smart people had examined the hedgerow problem. Army engineers with advanced degrees had proposed various solutions: explosive charges to blast through barriers, specialized bulldozer attachments, even flamethrowers to burn away vegetation. Nothing had worked consistently or safely. What made one sergeant think he could succeed where the experts had failed? It was a fair question, one that Culin himself had considered. The answer, he believed, was precisely that he wasn't an expert in the academic sense. He hadn't been trained to think about tank operations according to doctrine and established procedures. He saw the problem with fresh eyes, unencumbered by assumptions about what should work based on theory. Moreover, Culin understood something about the culture of mechanics versus the culture of engineers. Mechanics worked with what was available. When a part wasn't in stock, you fabricated something from scrap. When the manual said a repair required specialized tools, you improvised with whatever was in the toolbox. Mechanics lived in the real world of constraints and improvisation, not the theoretical world of optimal solutions. This practical mindset led Culin to his breakthrough insight about materials. The beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings had occurred just days earlier, were littered with German defensive obstacles. Among these were Czech hedgehogs, anti-tank barriers constructed from heavy steel beams, welded together in a three-dimensional cross pattern, like a massive, angular jack from a children's game. The Germans had placed thousands of these obstacles on the beaches, intending to impale or disable landing craft and tanks during the initial assault.